welcome in. My name is Cassidy Westron. I'm the Public Programs Coordinator here at the List Visual Arts Center. As you probably realized, you're here for a gallery talk with the lovely Miranda Dawson. Tonight we'll be hearing from Miranda. This is part of a graduate student talk series where we invite graduate students and postdocs to expand on our exhibitions using their expertise in a similar subject matter as a way to see how art and research are overlapping on MIT's campus. Tonight we'll be hearing from Miranda, a neuroengineer in the Department of Biological Engineering, developing advanced neuroimaging tools to study the brain-body connection. She earned her undergraduate degree from the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign and completed her PhD at MIT. Her research focuses on neural representations of physiological processes, particularly opioid-induced neuroplasticity across the central and peripheral nervous systems. Through this work, she aims to uncover the mechanisms underlying addiction and inform strategies for recovery. In this talk, Miranda will explore how neuroimaging can go beyond diagnostics and answer a central question. Does opioid dependency arise from the brain, the body, or their interaction? By selectively manipulating neuronal populations, her work reveals distinct forms of neuroplasticity that shape this relationship. Miranda's research will provide a framework to understand Goldin+Senneby's work, which explores the pharmaceutical industry and their interest in the lucrative treatments used to treat multiple sclerosis flare-ups. At the end, we'll have a Q&A where you'll have a chance to ask questions. And that is it. Thank you so much for being here and showing interest in our programming. And with that, I'll hand it off to Miranda.
Thank you. Hello, everyone. Thank you for coming. Right now, we're in an exhibition by Goldin+Senneby that's inspired by a body at war with itself. You can see here this pine resin that serves as a metaphor for an overactive immune response. Senneby was diagnosed with multiple sclerosis, and this experience inspires much of their art. You'll see on the left, or your right, I should say, for instance, Starfish and Citrus Thorn, which explores the history of immunitas, a word that in ancient Roman law described military conduct, but has been adopted in modern times in medicine to describe immunity. A very violent history for such a word. Now, how Senneby was diagnosed with MS was through magnetic resonance imaging, or MRI. An MRI is a really strong magnet, hundreds of times stronger than a refrigerator magnet. And when he was inside, listening to all the noises, they were taking an image of his brain. And what it revealed were different spots indicative of his MS. How he responds to these medical images is a huge influence in his work, and how I respond to medical images is a huge influence in how I conduct my scientific research. However, instead of looking at still anatomical images, I look at extremely fast, 1 to 2 seconds, of these functional MRI images. The principle of these images is that they're looking at neural activity that relate to blood flow. You see, we have this interesting phenomenon, neurovascular coupling, where an increase in neuronal activity influences more blood to rush in and supply oxygen and nutrients to those metabolically active neurons. What you see here is a slice from a rat brain. This is only 50 micrometers thick, and I've stained all the vessels with a red fluorescent dye. You can see how densely packed all these vessels are. In your brain, you have 400 miles of vessels to supply nutrients to 86 billion neurons, and each neuron is within 15 micrometers of the vessel. Now, when I look at these images, there's a lot of different things that I could explore. I could explore a disease, a response to a stimulus of interest. And much like Goldin+Senneby, I'm interested in a concept that actually has its root in ancient Roman law. Addictus was a word used to describe someone who is indebted and in constant servitude. And over hundreds of years, it evolved to refer to a compulsive need for a substance, being indebted to a substance that you're abusing. And how we defined addiction is very social and cultural. I think that this is a great time to engage with you all and ask what you think of when I say the word addiction or substance use disorder, as we now commonly refer to it. Does anybody have a response? Like, what kind of concepts do you think of? Go ahead. Alcoholism, yeah. Yeah.
Drugs and drug abuse.
Drug and drug abuse, yeah. Great. And what is something that draws people to use those drugs? Like alcohol or maybe heroin? Yeah.
Sometimes medical context, so issues born from prescribed medication.
Exactly. So, in the modern era, we think of the opioid epidemic and how people were prescribed painkillers, and then they report becoming addicted to these opioids. I really appreciate that context because oftentimes, especially historically, when we think of addiction, we ascribe it as a lack of self-control, as if it's a mental state that someone is choosing in a sense. They like the reward and they want to keep getting it. But obviously that's not the case. In actuality, it's a very complex cycle. And unfortunately, due to different sociopolitical forces, we've struggled to fully adopt this definition because of things like the war on drugs. I'm actually going to reference a book here that I found at the MIT library one day because there was a fire alarm and I couldn't go to lab. And I found it in one of the stacks. And I thought, I would love to read about addiction and opiates. And it was written in the 1940s by a sociologist named Richard Lynn-Smith. And I'm going to read what he said that was extremely controversial about the concept of addiction. A drug user does not expect at first to become addicted, but addiction is impressed upon the individual as soon as the abstinence symptoms are severe enough to frighten him. He then awakens to the fatal knowledge that he is hooked, which information other addicts are only glad to give him. When more of the drug is taken and the symptoms are relieved, the idea of the necessity of continuing its use is indelibly impressed on his mind and accepted without much resistance, as there is, besides the pain of withdrawal, considerable pleasure and relief also. And what this indicated is that instead of just shaming people for their drug use, we need to think about how to alleviate the cycle itself, the cycle of use, withdrawal, and craving. And this was so controversial, he was actually targeted by the federal government and his home was wiretapped. So you can see why people were not pursuing certain aspects of this research. And so what we have is a huge amount of research on drug reward, which is important. We care about the rewarding aspects, but very little on other aspects of the disease. Now, I'm interested in withdrawal. This is a very physical experience. Opioid withdrawal, by some, is described as the worst experience one can have in their life, the worst pain. If someone is a chronic user and they stop using, they'll experience stomach cramps, nausea, insomnia, heightened anxiety, and people will do anything to get out of this state, oftentimes causing them to take the drug again. Now, when this book was written, they reference a study that claims that over 95% of opiate users will relapse within a year. Now, in 2025, with no other intervention, even cognitive behavioral therapy, but no other substance, people have an over 90% relapse rate from opioids in the first year. So things haven't changed. What we're doing isn't working. And so if we try to look at other symptoms like withdrawal and how we can mitigate them, perhaps we can provide better therapeutics. What I do is I image rats at different points of fentanyl administration. I look at the brain when they first receive fentanyl, after a week of getting the fentanyl, and then during active withdrawal. Now, as you would expect, after the initial dose, the reward regions are super active. But after a week, if I look at the brain, just at rest, no stimulus, there's already fundamental changes to what it looks like in the scanner, which is actually crazy to think that such a huge shift in our neuroplasticity occurs on a timescale of days. Now, when I give naloxone, I see regions in the brain that are responsible for regulating physiology, such as the hypothalamus, and those are super active. And so what I was curious about is what if we looked at regions of the brain that we know are integrating what's happening here and happening here. Specifically, the insular cortex. The insula, which you have and rats have, it's lateral, both sides of the head, and it mediates how our body and our brain interact. And so what I have here is a rat brain that has some fluorescent protein in the insula itself. I'm going to pass it around if you so dare. Thank you. What I discovered is that this region is actually correlated to the regions that mediate reward, and during withdrawal are correlated to regions that mediate anti-reward. However, just seeing this correlation means nothing without causative information. And so what I did is I gave a really cool neuro tool called DREADS. Basically what I did is I gave a non-immunogenic virus. It injects DNA that makes a protein. This protein will inhibit my region of interest. And so I inhibit this brain region using this virus during different points in the cycle. And what I found is that I can actually reverse some of the symptoms of withdrawal, which is a completely unexpected finding given that it's a higher order brain region. And as I move forward, I know that there's many ways that we could access the brain as a therapeutic. If you've heard of deep brain stimulation for things like depression or Parkinson's, that's an invasive but potential option. And there's also transcranial magnetic stimulation, basically these coils that we can put on our heads that deliver electrical stimulation that are becoming more and more popular. But I wanted to take a step back and think, what if we just looked at the periphery and we ignored the brain for a second? Imagine there was a drug that would bind to an opioid receptor but would never get to the brain. And you might have taken it, actually. Raise your hand if you've heard of Imodium, also known as Loperamide. Oh yeah, we got some traveler's diarrhea up in here. Woo woo! I bought this off of Amazon for $4. And long story short, I can induce withdrawal with this. It never gets to the brain. And if I give it at a high enough dose, long enough, my rats go in withdrawal, which is an insane thought, because for so long we thought it had to involve opioids going to the brain itself. And actually, when you read the medical literature, people on the street are already doing this. And they've started referring to this as a poor man's methadone. However, it has really strong side effects, particularly in the heart. In fact, there's a warning on this box saying that high doses can cause heart problems. And so we need to find other ways to help, mitigate this issue, but it's a very interesting potential therapeutic target. Now, I want to take a step back from all the science and think about where we are here in Boston. Oftentimes when we're in our academic institutions, we forget that these problems are right next to us. And so actually just a couple of miles down Mass Ave, at the intersection of Massachusetts Avenue and Cass, there is this region that is known, unfortunately, by the phrase methadone mile. Now, because of the stigma around that, more people are calling it Recovery Road, but it's because there's a huge unhoused population that depends on methadone treatment that live around there. And if you're walking down the street, taking a T, you may be actually facing people who are suffering from this disease. And while I think it's great to do this research and try to find a cure and different therapies, there are things that we can do now. And so actually in the audience, we have Ben Lewis, if you want to raise your hand. Hi, Ben. Yeah. He's an MIT PhD student studying drug policy. And he introduced me to the nonprofit he helped start called End Overdose. And what we do is we do trainings for the drug Narcan, which looks like a little nasal spray here, also known as naloxone. And so I'm going to go through a really quick training with you. And then if you want to meet me after this gallery showing, I can give you some Narcan out in the hall. Oh yeah, that's right. So yeah, look. Yeah, I'm going to use this on him. Because of the camera, maybe you can stand next to me. Okay. So this is my friend here, Ben. Now, I'm going to look for the 3 signs of opioid overdose. The first are pinpoint pupils. So if I were to take my flashlight and look into his eyes, wow, those cannot get any smaller. The second is slowed breathing or no breathing. So I'm going to look at his chest and see how quickly, if at all, his chest is moving up and down. And finally, I'm going to see if he's conscious. So a good way to test this is a sternal rub. I won't do it really hard. Most people respond if you push into their sternum. And if you see these 3 signs, it's called a triad of overdose. You're going to want to call for help, call for medical help, 911, because this is a temporary solution. And then you're going to give the Narcan. And just like a nasal spray, you're going to take it, push it up his nose, boop, and you're going to give him a couple of minutes. See if he's responding. You'll have 2 doses. That doesn't work. Go up the other nostril. Boop. And hopefully he's responding by now. You can also administer rescue breaths. So that will give oxygen to his lungs and his blood, make sure his stomach isn't moving, just his chest. And once help arrives, you've done your part, and you've helped save a life. And you're protected by the Good Samaritan law in Massachusetts, which means that you can't get into legal trouble for helping someone in a medical emergency. So thank you, Ben. Usually we have a CPR dummy, but yeah. Yeah, and so with all of that said, I hope that I've given you some insight into the science of addiction, practical ways that you can actually help our community, and I hope that it's given you more empathy for a body and a mind at war with itself, much like the work here is trying to represent. And so with that, I'd like to thank you all.